now's your time. This is, I think, the millennials' decade to stand into and take up more leadership roles across all of our facets of society, and make all of the necessary adjustments, whether that's from an economic perspective, whether that's from a cultural perspective, whether that's from a political perspective.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining in on tonight's webinar. My name is Radha Enchi, and I will be the moderator for our talk tonight with Rocket Scopelliti. But before we start, just a quick introduction to the PDF for Professional Development Forum, which is PDF. PDF was established to help diverse young professionals to reach their full potential in the modern Australian workplace. We believe that everyone, not just the elite few, should have access to the knowledge, mindset, and networks to develop themselves. We also believe that becoming the best versions of ourselves will lead a happier, more fulfilling life and inspire those around us to do the same. And we do this by running events that aim to inform, connect, and inspire, and by sharing what we learned with our community. Now, just a few housekeeping rules. We encourage everyone to please turn on your webcams so we can better connect with each other. Feel free to also leave your LinkedIn details in the chat box so you can add each other afterwards. And if you have any questions at any time throughout the session or would like to comment on anything that was said, then feel free to type them into the chat box. You will also be invited to ask your questions in the Q&A session. Please also note that this session is being recorded, so it may be shared on social media. Tonight, we are very lucky to have Rocky Scopelliti as our special guest. Rocky is a futurologist, an author, and an internationally recognized thought leader on demographic and technological change. His expertise and pioneering behavioral economics research on the topics have led him to being featured in many elite media outlets such as Sky Business News, the Australian Financial Review, Forbes, and many others. Recently, Rocky has published all his findings on the topics in his latest book called Australia 2030, Where the Bloody Hell Are We? The book is based on a major study conducted before and during the coronavirus pandemic. It also looks into Australian professional sentiments about the decade ahead, including future business growth opportunities and job opportunities. And today, Rocky will be sharing with us some of his key insights from his book and what this will mean for you. So without further ado, I would like to hand over to Rocky. Rocky?
Great, fantastic. Well, thank you, Radha, and welcome everyone. It's a pleasure to spend this time with you, taking you through some insights, as mentioned, associated with my latest research and book. But I'll also augment that with research that I've done over the many years that I've been studying the confluence or the intersection of behavioural change associated with the millennial demographic, which is broadly aged between about 19 to 39 years, and also technology. Now, if there's two words that I'd love you to take away, I'm just going to introduce those in a sec. The question at the heart of my research interests is how do we increase our capacity to adapt to a world of accelerated change? Now, what's fascinating about that question is, firstly, I've been researching it for 16 years. Now, before some of you think, my God, what's he been doing for 16 years? Hasn't he answered this question? Well, what's fascinating about this question is that unlike a puzzle where we might know the pathway to the end, or in fact, we might even know the end, as in a jigsaw puzzle, and it's our challenge to put the pieces together. This question here behaves more like a mystery, and you know, what I've learned over the many years is that there is actually no answer to this question. But what I can do is provide clues and signposts on perhaps what's around the next corner. And so that's what this presentation is essentially going to draw upon. Now, there's been two absolutely beautiful, wonderful words that have influenced my life and my research life. And the first is youthquake. And, you know, when I first started writing my book called Youthquake 4.0, I asked a friend of mine if he knew what the definition of this word was, and he thought it was a type of headache that young people give their parents. And I said, well, it's close, but not quite. Youthquake was in fact first termed by the editor-in-chief of Vogue magazine in the mid-60s to explain the phenomena associated with a significant cultural, political and social change that the 60s became quite famous for. More recently, 5 decades later, it resurfaced to become the Oxford Dictionary's 2017 Word of the Year to reflect the sentiment associated with the change occurring with the millennial demographic. Now, what's fascinating about this is that millennials are the children of the baby boomer generation that gave rise to the word youthquake in the mid-60s. Now, the reason why this is important to bring to your attention is that on the back of any significant cultural, political, social, and economic change, we will see a very significant transformation in a whole range of new services. So, for example, in the 60s, we saw the rise of consumer credit. We saw the unquenchable thirst that people had for white goods and electrical goods and the like. And so the question here is to clearly about, on the back of this youthquake, what are the new industries? What are the new services? What are the new opportunities going to manifest as a result of that? Now, the second word I'd like to introduce you to is a word called juvenescence. Now, a little bit about the background to the find or discovery of this word was that I realized that despite the definition of the word transformation, the way it's been applied over many years now has led us to believe that success is associated with a transformation, which is a once-off event. But history now records that once-off events do not explain organizational survival. So when we look at the Fortune 500, for example, in 1920, the average life of a Fortune 500 organization was about 65 years. Today, that's down to about 15 years. And I would predict that over the coming decade, that's going to decline to even further to probably 10 years and below. And so the point here is that once-off events, big digital transformations or big technological transformations, will not guarantee you'll be around tomorrow. And so I thought what we needed was a completely new way of thinking about survival and about leadership, and one that was really built on the notion of adaptation. And so juvenescence is a wonderful Latin word that I discovered defined as the constant state of youthfulness. And when we think about organizational survival and adaptation, it's not necessarily something new. In fact, this is going back to Darwinian's theory of survival. And those who constantly adapt survive. And so the point here is that when we think about our future, we need to let go of beliefs associated with, once-off big transformations that are going to unveil this shiny new organization. In fact, success is going to be predicated on the capacity to adapt to a constantly changing environment. And I think Juvenescence quintessentially explains the leadership characteristics that we're going to see of leaders, over the coming decade. So hold those two words in the back of your mind as we go through this presentation. So what am I going to cover today? Well, we're going to look at demographic change. Now, although my research speciality is on the millennial generation, I'm going to also explain the dilemma we face with the aging population. We're going to talk about the economy because we just had the budget, and we've got to talk about the implications of what we've experienced in the last decade and what they mean for us in a post-COVID world. We're going to talk about the environment, technology, science, and some of the 37 predictions that I've made in my new book, Australia 2030. And of course, we're going to talk about the region. Now, I'm going to contextualize all of this in the fourth industrial revolution, which is defined as our fusion between our digital, physical, biological, and environmental worlds. So let's kick off. Let's talk about the economy. Now, with every chapter in the book, I felt it was quite important to try and quintessentially capture the essence of the last decade in a movie quote from films that may be familiar to many of us. And I thought Telemy's Dreaming was very appropriate for describing perhaps what we experienced in our economy over the last decade. And so I'm going to talk about these points here: productivity, the unprecedented economic conditions, a little bit about integrative economics, and what we can expect on the other side. Now, firstly, when we look at the question of what do Australian professionals believe are going to affect the world and Australia over the coming years, what's interesting is that those that responded to the study over the months of January and February, now remember, we just came off the bushfires and the national crisis of 2019 and 20 on climate change. And we're comparing that to those who responded in March and April. Now, you will recall that March was when the eye of the COVID storm hit. So we shifted quickly from what was a worldwide health crisis quickly into an economic crisis. And so what you can see here is that in the purple bars, you can see that climate change was ranked #1 as the most significant issue to affect Australia and the world or over the coming decade. But then reflected in the brown coloured bars there, you can see how quickly we shifted from climate change to low economic growth as being our single biggest issue. Now, that's pretty intuitive, but I just want to bring your attention to an area that I'm talking quite a lot about, and that is to do with inequality. And so when I analyse these results, I was quite surprised how we feel that inequality is not really an issue here in Australia and a marginal issue at best in the world. And whether that's income, whether that's gender, whether that's, you know, across whatever characteristic, that really surprised me. But it also helps explain why Australia is behind many other OECD nations when it comes to issues such as, you know, pay gender gap, such as you know, gender inequality. And so particularly at senior levels, board levels and chairs. So I'd say, although climate change and low economic growth were quite intuitive in terms of what we would expect people to say, inequality came as quite a surprise, because it is a much, you know, greater and significant issue than perhaps what we think it is. Now, what does this all mean? Well, it just translates into much deeper issues where, you know, our trust, our confidence in government and has significantly plummeted. And we'll unpack this as we go through, because the results are showing that when it comes to how confident are we that the government has adequate plans for the future in terms of investing in the right industries and the like, we have no confidence. And when it comes to leadership, it's the same issues and trust as well. And so when it comes to thinking about signposts, now remember, I'm more curious as a researcher about what are the inflection points, what do we look for as the signposts, rather than actually saying, you know, this is gonna happen in 2025 or 2027 or what have you. And I think these are the two most important signposts for us to be observing around the economy, and that is the decade of debt. The media narrative and its preoccupation with surplus, you know, we need to let go of and become accustomed to the fact that our economy will hit the $1 trillion debt mark and will unlikely recover from a negative position over the coming. Now, in many respects, we've also got to remind ourselves that that debt is being accumulated at the point where we are seeing the lowest rates on interest around the world, and certainly here in Australia. And so our you know, our obsessiveness with surpluses, I think we need to again let go of. The other thing that that's most important is to understand that, you know, pandemics, like many other, you know, crises, are not necessarily just one-off events. And we can anticipate that the world will be in a lot more turbulence this coming decade than what it was in the past. And so our ability to respond also has to be factored into that. So in other words, our systems have to be able to be more adaptable than ever before, and they'll put to the test during COVID, right? Our healthcare system and the capacity of the healthcare system, our social services, all of these things have been put to the test. And so, you know, variability has to be one of the foremost principles in the way with which we look at designing our systems to support our populations going forward. Now, let's talk about the environment. I'm hoping that many of you saw that wonderful film called The Dish. It's one of my favourite Australian movies, and it's for those of you who didn't see it, it's a movie about the Parkes satellite installation that played the critical role in the first landing of human on the moon. And there's a wonderful line in that movie where the NASA representative had to perhaps distort the truth somewhat in reporting back to NASA the fact that we lost the Apollo 11 spaceship for quite some time. And so the classic line is, that's bullshit. You just bullshitted NASA. Well, I would say that quintessentially summarizes perhaps what we as a population were led to believe about climate change in the last decade. Now, I've plotted this on a chart, to really bring this to everybody's attention. And that is that, we began the decade with the message from the Rudd government at the time that climate change was our greatest moral challenge. But we finished the decade on the opposite end of the spectrum. And so the politicization of climate change in the last decade led us to plummet to an all-time low in our beliefs that global warming is a serious and pressing issue. And even still today, we still haven't recovered to the levels that we believed back in 2006, as represented in that green line. And so, the question here is quite fascinating, because why didn't we listen to our experts on climate change, perhaps as we did with COVID? And it's a fascinating question, because the evidence of what occurred in 2019 and 20 was there in reports that were produced, back in 2008 by Professor Garnett on looking at on the impact of climate change, where the prediction of what happened in 2019 and 20 was there. Same with the CSIRO study in 2009. And so, I think this gives us cause to now pause and think, who are we actually listening to and taking stock of when it comes to the environment and climate change? And it certainly shouldn't be the political parties, but it should be our experts at COVID. But we're now facing three really important, inextricably linked tipping points. The first is the national security implications. As we saw in 2019 and 20, we saw our defence forces deployed nationwide to assist in that. Well, that requires planning. And so you can't ignore the demand on our defence forces to assist in climate change and the planning of that. The second is that we are now starting to see the inflection point being reached where renewable energy costs are declining below that of fossil and other fuels. We've seen that in the United States, and we'll see that also here in Australia. And then lastly, the significant and tragic impact on the whole population of 2019 and 2020 is that, there is nothing further to be gained by trying to resist climate change, perhaps as the Abbott government did in their time. Okay, let's look at the region. So what I was fascinated about here is to really look at the attitudes that we have to what's going on in Asia, and most importantly, our role in Asia. Now, the first point I'd like to make is that we are now staring into what's referred to as the Asian century. And the Asian century is the inflection point upon which, you know, the center of economic gravity will shift from the West and over to East. And that inflection point, you know, has occurred this year. And so Australia really has to consider its role within the region, given that the Asian century will be the primary focal point of economic activity over the next period. And so when I ask the question about whether, you know, how do we feel about Asia being, you know, the regional leader, socially, culturally, political, and the like, we can see that a large proportion of Australians are really unsure about that. We you know, and that can be seen by the grey bar in the you know, across each of the demographic groups. And so you can see that as really reflecting the uncertainty we feel towards our role in the region. And so there's never been a more important time for us to really sort of deal with that, particularly given the fact that Australia is a middle power. And the reality is that the Asian century has arrived. It's going to become the focal point for all economic activity over the foreseeable future. But we've got to decide what our role will be in the region, together with other middle and minor powers, particularly in the ASEAN region, with countries such as Indonesia, the Philippines, Thailand, Singapore, Malaysia. You know, the cluster of the 11 ASEAN nations together make a very important counterbalance to the economic and geopolitical tensions associated with China. Okay, let's now talk about demographics. Does anybody? I hope people remember the movie Muriel's Wedding. Another one of my all-time Australian favourites. But there was a wonderful line where Muriel was courting her Swedish fiance, and she offered him a Tim Tam, which I thought was a very quintessential Australian way of courting at that particular point in time. Okay, let's begin at one end of the spectrum. We have, like many other nations, an aging population crisis. And the effects of that are going to be felt more so this decade than any other decade in our past. Now, if we think about the proportion of working aged people, which are defined by the OECD as those broadly aged between 25 and 64, relative to the proportion of a population 65 years and over, we produce a measure which is referred to as the old age dependency measure. In other words, it is the proportion of working people who can support all of the systems, all of the social welfare systems and support systems required for an aging population. Now, the green line is Australia. The dotted line that follows that is North America. The purple line is Europe, and then the pink line is Japan. So Australia, North America, Europe, and Japan have the lowest proportion of working age people relative to other countries and parts of the world to support our aging population. And this is a very significant issue, very, very significant issue, because when you look at the projected costs to the Australian government towards the latter parts of this decade, the projected costs of Medicare, the accommodation of the NDIS, school funding, family tax, all of those combined, the costs required to support the aging population will exceed all of those combined. And so that's what I mean about this is going to hit us much harder this coming decade than the past decade. Now, at the other end of the spectrum, how do we feel about a world being led by millennials? Now, let's put this in perspective. Millennials now represent 1 in 3 in the global population. Here in Australia, they represent 6.2 million people. Millennials will only, or not only have they already become the largest demographic group on the planet, they will increasingly permeate all facets of our society as consumers, employees, as lawmakers, policy makers. They will permeate all aspects of our society. And so I posed this question in the research, which was, how do we feel about this demographic? And do we think that they're going to be better transformational leaders over the coming decade than perhaps generations before them? Now, overwhelmingly so. Overwhelmingly, people agreed with that statement, which I think is really important, particularly for this group of constituents, because, this is the confidence that other demographics have in you, and your contribution, your leadership contribution into the future. And so to the point where, this is 1 in 2 people in the population. What was really interesting, though, was that there's about 8% of millennials who disagreed with that statement. So I'm not sure what the answer is to that. So there you go. Now, okay, so there's 2 really, really important tipping points to observe here. The first is that youth voice matters. We've now got Gen Z. I've got 3 of them. One of them has just reached voting age, and they have completely different views about society compared to other generations before them. They'll increasingly exercise their vote when it comes to policies and the like. And then the second, as we sort of talked about at the start, was that the aging population is really going to impact us economically as we figure out over the coming decade how we are going to socially support an aging population. Okay, let me now just quickly talk about risk and, about trust. And trust is a risky thing, which is why I've presented it in a, risk management framework, because this is quite important to understand the consequences associated with the erosion of trust through the years. Now, when it comes to looking at trust and its inequality. Now, trust inequality is something that was defined by the Edelman Group, who've been studying trust for the last 20 years. It's a fascinating longitudinal study. And Australia leads the world in the inequality associated within our population around trust. Now, let me just explain what this is. Now, there's 2 groups. One that's referred to as the informed public. That is those who are wealthier, more educated, of the higher socioeconomic profiles compared to the mass population. And when we compare the 2, that's where we see the gap emerged. And so, in other words, when it comes to business and government, the people in the more affluent aspects of our society have a much greater level of trust in them relative to the normal population. And so this is a problem in terms of the way that we think about the role of business and government in our society. When it comes to the question of who do we trust the most and the least to look after our best interests when it comes to technological and scientific developments over the coming years, it's clearly academic and research institutions. That was so for all of the respondents during the months of January and February, and it virtually doubled during the eye of the COVID storm over the months of March and April. So in other words, when COVID hit, we looked more towards our academic and research institutions compared to government or tech players when it comes to looking after our best interests going forward. And this shows the increase in dependency that we're putting on our independent experts associated with technology and science. Now, what's fascinating here is when we look at trust in the past, it was something that we typically bestowed upon an organization or group of individuals. And the idea that I set up here in this chapter is that trust is becoming decentralized, where we are placing much greater degrees of trust in technology than what we are in institutions. And so this is quite an important insight in terms of thinking about trust, because what we've in effect done now is shifted the conversation away from the question of who do we trust to what do we trust. And so there's two really important tipping points here. And the first is, for any democracy to function effectively, we've got to close this inequality gap because we are being exposed all around the world to what's referred to eloquently as fake news. And so this is creating divides in our society which are not really truly reflecting our true democracy. And so I think that is a really important issue for us to resolve and reconcile over the coming decade. And then secondly, when it comes to, again, the question of trust, it's now shifting to a question of what do we trust? And in that question, identity, privacy, and security become one conversation, not three separate conversations. Okay, let's now step up into the good gear. Let's have a conversation about technology, science, and engineering. Now, the question is, are we concerned or not that the government's actually investing adequately in technological, scientific, as well as skills development over the coming year? And you can see disproportionately we are concerned. More than 1 in 2 of us are concerned that we're not investing adequately in this area. And you can see how that skyrocketed during the eye of the COVID storm over the months of March and April. Now, this is an issue. This is a very big issue. It was partly addressed in the budget, but I would have liked to have seen a lot more announcements than what was made. Now, this is also a very, very important insight, and that is that in relation to our investment in research, we are tending to not focus on the things that actually matter. When we look at the share of spend that organisations are investing in this area compared to originating their own thinking, and then when we look at what's spent by government, business, our educational institutions and the like, we can see that government as well as business over the last decade has not invested adequately in the areas of research and development. So, in other words, the insight that people reflected, and that was that they were concerned that we're not investing adequately in science and skills, was well founded quantitatively. Now, when it comes to looking at the fourth industrial revolution, what you're looking at on the left-hand side are just a range of the main technologies that are associated with that. And when you can look at the question on the right-hand side in terms of what technologies do Australian executives believe or professionals believe are going to impact the most over the next coming 3 years, you can see that what's common in all of those technologies is one thing, and that is data. And so when it comes to looking at data and thinking about data, we've got to start learning to compete analytically. Now, in a study that I did of about 78 organisations across Australia and the Asia Pacific, we can learn that there is a evolutionary process associated with being able to compete analytically. A stage 5 analytical competitor can be thought of as an Amazon, a eBay, Facebook, all of those kinds of guys. They're stage 5 analytical competitors. They can systematically outcompete their competitors and peers using data because they can see opportunity where others can't. Most traditional organizations are in stage 1 or stage 2. And so when we look at and think about all of those awesome technologies, we're also got to think about the multiplicative effect of when you start putting these technologies together. So for example, when you put AI and cloud together, all of a sudden, you're able to analyze data, store and transmit data in a way that we've never been able to do so productively and efficiently as we have before. When you start combining the Internet of Things, 5G networks that are being now rolled out, and augmented reality and virtual reality together, all of a sudden you're able to create experiences to be able to make decisions that we were never able to make before. Now, when it comes to trust, as I mentioned before, the shift is now toward technology. And so distributed ledger, blockchain technologies are going to play a very important role in how we assign trust into the devices, data, and things that we do online. And then lastly, quantum computing is going to give us the capacity, the processing capacity, to be able to solve many of the problems that we have, whether it's in the scientific area, the technological area, whether it's in the space area, that we've not had the capacity to do ever before at speeds and rates like never before. And so now to bring this together into a sort of framework for you, the way to think about our world is that we are about to become hyper-connected in terms of the number of devices, whether they're wearable, whether they're autonomous, that are going to point data at our organizations. And so the central intelligence of an organization will be its data. What's wrapped around that data and what that data is used for is then to create and leverage all of these wonderful technologies associated with the fourth industrial revolution that will create experiences that allow us to live in the real time. And so this is what will augment, as I mentioned at the start, the digital, physical, and biological worlds. Now, 2 tipping points. Execution of the NISA plan that was developed for Australia to 2030 is really critical to this, and we need to hold government to account on that. And then secondly, we've got to improve what's referred to as the innovation efficiency ratio. The innovation efficiency it can be thought of as all of the inputs to produce a innovation output. And our efficiency ratio is nowhere near where it needs to be. In other words, we're not converting all of the things that we're putting into the innovation factory as effectively as we possibly can. Okay, let's now finish up with some predictions on the road ahead. This decade is what I refer to as the programmatic decade. The best way to think about this is think about all technological and scientific developments as being programmable in software. And so there is a clear pathway to which all of these awesome technologies are going to unfold over the coming decade. Now we'll look at some of these. I'm not going to hit on all of these points. These are just some of the predictions that I've made in the book about the decade ahead. The first point is that data will become hypercritical in areas such as healthcare, financial services, right? Real-time, accurate data. If you're on the receiving end of a robot that's performing surgery on you in some rural place, you want that data to be reliable and you want it to be in real time and you don't want it to fault. And so that's what we mean about hypercritical. And so the way we treat data from a regulatory perspective and legislative perspective is going to only become increasingly more and more important. Now, when it comes to our physical world, we will increasingly become hyper-connected through a multitude of different devices, whether we're wearing those devices, whether our cities are exposing those through, sensory devices in a shopping center or in a city. The buildings that we live in will become hyper-connected. So not only will they become interconnected, but they're going to become intelligent as well. Lastly, there's, we can expect that in our scientific area, we will see the rise of synthetic biology that will allow us to create precision medicines to treat patients who have specific types of cancers or specific types of illnesses that we simply don't have today. Now, let me now start bringing this together. The environment, as I mentioned before, is we are hitting that in that crossroads, that inflection point where the costs are now sort of becoming more attractive compared to other types of energies. Storage is becoming one of the most important parts of that equation, and of course our exploration to the moon again and beyond. So what do we think we're going to be experiencing in 2030? So this was a future retrospective question put to those, and I've got some bad news for Elon Musk and for Richard Branson. Unfortunately, recreational flight to outer space is not something that rated terribly highly on in terms of our desirability. But you can see that most of us are hoping and looking toward new treatments for illnesses through these technological and scientific developments compared to what we have today. And when asked about the future retrospective, about their perspectives on their technology, you can see that Australians have an absolutely wonderfully positive outlook on the role that technology and scientific developments play in terms of our social, cultural, and economic future. So everything that I've talked about and more is available in the books that I've published over the years, the most recent of which is Australia 2030. I'm just now going to pause, have a sip of coffee while I answer some questions. Thank you.
That's very awesome. Thank you so much, Rocky. It's got a lot of information to pack in there as well. So this will be the Q&A session, and if anyone would like to ask a question, could you please notify me and if you would like to ask a question to the group, you're welcome to.
Yeah, hey Rocky, how you going? That was really good insight on what everything's going to look like on different topics. And you mentioned a lot around trust, fake news, and millennials. Okay. Misinformation, I feel like it's a massive issue, and it's always been. But I feel as though we're noticing that way more because of the amount of fake news going on around COVID and the earth is flat, whatever. But what do you recommend to young people dealing with all these news going on from multiple sources? What is your recommendation and suggestion going forward?
Listen to our experts. You know, when I wrote the environment and climate change chapter, you know, I found that quite personally upsetting. And the reason why is because I couldn't stop thinking about the question of why weren't we listening to our experts? Why didn't we listen to the CSIRO? Why didn't we listen to Professor Garnett? Why didn't we listen to our chief fire wardens? And so if you look at what's interesting was there was some results published only about a month ago. Now, Australia ranked #1 in the world for our response to COVID, and the explanation of that rating was because we listened to our experts. And so why didn't we do that? We allowed the politicization of climate change, and I think that's what I found personally upsetting. So I would say, to answer your question, listen to the experts. Listen to the experts. We have, you know, some of the most amazing technological, scientific, engineering expertise in the world here. They're the people that the research shows we trust to look after our best interests going forward. And so, you know, I'll give you another little anecdote. You remember when the COVID app was first launched? Do you recall, Ella, when the government made its announcement? The following day, what we heard was the backlash around privacy, you know, security, intrusion of, you know, privacy and the like. And that narrative went on for a couple of days, right, while politicians were trying to sell it to us. And then we had our chief medical officer and the wonderful state-based chief medical officers, you know, stepping forward and saying, these are the reasons why, you know, we think you should use that app. And then all of a sudden, you know, off it went. That's what I'm talking about. Listen to the experts. Listen to the experts. We cannot afford this decade to have so many really significant issues being politicized as perhaps they were in the last decade. And I'm just like everybody else on issues of climate change and the other, but I don't think we're going to tolerate that this coming decade.
So I might give you a curveball there, Rocky. So you mentioned listen to the experts and how Australia's rated #1 in the world. Ironically, I happen to be coming from a country called Taiwan when this all happened. And as you might be aware of Taiwan's response, and I would say when we listened to the experts, Taiwan was the one country that actually did listen to the experts to the point that they banned travel from China all the way back in January.
There you go.
Right? Now, having said that, Australian experts, if we had listened to the Australian experts, well, you could, okay, so I take your point about politicization, but if you tried to ban travel from China back in January, you would have heard howls of cries of racism. And that is your point around politicization, right? around COVID. And in fact, in comparison, I'm sure in relative to the rest of the world, Australia did a great job, but potentially not as good as it could be. My point is around sort of how do you tell and what authority do you offer to the experts? My issue with climate change is that the politicization happened long before, without getting it into a political issue, right? It was a politicization that led to the loss of trust and not the other way around. We're almost trying to play catch up now. So you mentioned fake news. And the reality is, and I think a lot of young people attest to this. The reality is that media's credibility has long been discredited, and that is why no one trusts the news anymore. But it's not the loss of trust that led to fake news. It's fake news that led to a loss of trust. And so, how can we get it back? How can we listen to the experts when the experts have already been corrupted and politicized?
Yeah, I wouldn't say that. So I understand your point, but I think independence of thought is something that any thriving democracy relishes. And we've got a very vibrant set of independent thought leaders in Australia, and we are unencumbered, perhaps like other countries, in our thought. But your point around the media is actually really important, because if you look at COVID and if you look at a lot of the studies done on trust throughout the COVID period, you found that people were extremely frustrated with government. They were extremely disappointed with media. But again, they look towards the experts. And so that's what we're tuned into. We're now tuned into listening and trusting experts.
But the problem is even the media don't know how to pick experts. So I'll take your example of COVID Safe. So the COVID Safe was a great app, right? It actually had quite a level of cybersecurity associated. And naturally, I went to the cybersecurity experts to take their opinions on COVID app. And undoubtedly, they said two things. One is that, yes, it's safe. They looked at the codes, yes, it's safe. It doesn't give away unnecessary information, doesn't retain any of that. But the second and more pointed thing the experts have said is that it doesn't work. without the Apple API, this thing was never going to work when the phone was on standby mode. And again, government didn't listen to the experts, the media didn't listen to the experts, nobody listened to cybersecurity experts. And as a result, COVID Safe was a bit of a schmozzle, right? It just didn't work. The problem was the media do not know who the experts were. It was only people who worked in the cybersecurity industry that knew who were the authoritative voices, but the media weren't giving them the coverage that they deserved.
So the wonderful thing about the democratization of information is that you can select which people, right down to an individual level, that you choose to listen to. And I choose not to listen to primetime news. I choose to receive my information from sources that I trust. And so in a world where we now have access to instant information on developments occurring anywhere around the world, make good choices. Don't follow crap. It would be my advice there. There's lots of wonderful experts all around the world, right? Get to know them, and on topics and areas that you are passionate about. That doesn't necessarily mean make the decision based on what they say, but what you're receiving is good advice, and ultimately it's your choice. And that's what's getting distorted in this fog of news, entertainment, reality shows. So I think that if you care deeply about this, which I do, then I'm very selective about who I allow to occupy my thoughts and mine about information.
Do you mind if I ask you just a quick question? It's more like a self-guidance, really. I think like the truth of the matter is just a matter of life and death. say COVID is very clear. It's right there in you. If you don't act right now, people just gonna die. So I think that's why they choose to act on that. Now, global warming, it's 100 years extinction progress. So by then, those people in the power leadership right now, they don't really have to worry about it because they'll be long gone. So the question is for us who stay here, will be the next generation that, stay around. What is it that practically we can do to at least make sure that the extinction does not happen?
Well, exercise your vote. Remember, millennials.
I don't think that it's a practical way because it's just gonna be delayed. Like, the people get in politics, they keep talking about the same thing over and over again, and there's no results. We have seen that happen since the 80s.
Yeah,
I've seen it happen since the 80s.
yeah. No, you've got a right to be cynical about political performance. But as I mentioned, if you think about tipping points, there is now no benefit to be gained through inaction.
Yeah, I agree on that for sure. My question is more like practically, like aside from the politics, right? What kind of activities young people should be more practically engaged really to make a true difference?
Yeah, well, the whole area of energy, that is truly the most important developments, I would think, over the coming decade. And so, if you want to make a difference in terms of your own career, then I would say, we're doing remarkable things. Innovation, out of a lot of areas around solar, storage, a whole range of things. Get involved, get involved.
So you say like young people should more like, think progressively, and they, instead of like look for traditional sort of industry or whatever, just, put the knowledge together, the education together they have at the moment, and maybe just come up in whole new industries, right?
Yeah, I've been saying this now for 16 years, and I'm on the public record for this. Millennials have the most remarkable problem solving, critical thinking, and creativity of any other generation. We are now in the imagination, decade. Now's your time.
I have a question on that point. So it being what you shared with us is about how the world is going to be quite technology based, and this is going to be really affecting the knowledge workers and innovation workers, and how they can remain innovative and continuously be creative in the workplace. How would this affect them, especially when the world has become so different in terms of keeping their productivity levels? One of the things that has been introduced by our researchers has been enabling bureaucracy, relational workplace designs to help them be able to have the more productivity and creative in the workplace. What would you say will be one of the things that we should be looking forward to as young people in the workplace, as we go into areas of knowledge as knowledge workers, because that's pretty much most of the job opportunities are and will be in the future?
Yeah, that's right. Australia's economy is 70% based on services. And this, I think, ties back into the question of what's our role in the region, because what surrounds us is a third of the world's population in developing economies that can really utilize the wonderful expertise that we have here. And so I think, we've got wonderful education, research, institutions and capabilities, but the models of education are outdated because the pace of change is outstripping the structures of a lot of these disciplines. So for example, if you're, my daughter's just started university this year, I've been encouraging her for many years that it's more important that you go to university than necessarily picking the right field, because it's more important to be exposed to new thinking, be able to, meet new people, get new ideas. Through all of that, you're going to find your passion. And then when you do find your passion, it's really important then to think about learning as a lifelong part of your life. We've come out of a system that, you know, after 3, 5 years, whatever it is you're doing, you know, you're good to go for the next 40 years. Well, the reality is you can't predict what industries are going to survive and exist, let alone what jobs are going to survive and exist in the next 5 years. So again, this comes back to juvenescence, right?
Yes.
And you can embrace juvenescence as your own personal leadership philosophy in terms of, you know, constant adaptation, constant state of youthfulness, right? Constantly changing, constantly adapting. The millennial generation can do that better than any other generation before. That's why I've always been so confident in change and that it's in good hands. And 1 in 2 Australians of all walks of life agree with that. This is, I think, the millennials' decade to stand into and take up more leadership roles across all of our facets of society, and make all of the necessary adjustments, whether that's from an economic perspective, whether that's from a cultural perspective, whether that's from a political perspective. You know, our parliament is sadly disproportionately skewed towards older demographics. Who are the ministers that are representing the young people? Well, they're old people. And how can that be when a third of our population are young people? Or sorry, I shouldn't say young. Let me just withdraw that. Millennials being 19 to 39 years, you know, that's not, we shouldn't be looking at that demographic as young people, you know, anymore. You know, if you look at Jacinda Ardern, for example, in New Zealand, she's a remarkable leader and earned the respect internationally in a very quick period of time. Now, she's not technically a millennial, but she's within 1 or 2 years of that. But you can see what a contemporary political leader can do. And so, you know, whether politics is your thing, whether it's, you know, business is your thing, whatever's your thing, right? Step forward, lean in. Your views matter.
However, in that sense, like how we're supposed to step up and be able to take up leadership in positions like that, it's quite hard when in the workplace we're seen as being the younger kids, and we're overlooked basically because we think, oh, we have less experience, you don't know much, but then how can you understand what we're doing? Because we've been here for this long, this amount of time. How can you just come and give us your opinion when you've just started?
That's why 1 in 2 Australian millennials prefer not to work for an employer, but work for themselves.
Right.
1 in 2. So now, and I often remind large organizations of this, if you're thinking about the future of work and your labor workforces, 6.2 million people has just come down to 3.1. You're going to have to compete against other organizations as to why you know, a limited pool of people should work for you. That's what I see is coming. Now, the other thing as well, just to bring this up to a brighter note, is that, you know, take great comfort, as I did, in the budget announcements that support, you know, people less than 40 years of age. You know, if there's one really important point you take from that in this moment of, you know, craziness and uncertainty, is the government has recognised that and is trying to pull levers in order to foster growth, which will come from a labour perspective, primarily from this demographic over the coming decade. So I thought that was terrific set of initiatives. I would have liked to have seen a lot more, of course, but I think it's a wonderful step forward in the conditions that we have from a budgetary perspective. So, you know, how can these things help you? I think is really the key here.
Awesome, thank you. We would like to end with one last question. It's a very light question. Intermission Melbourne, would you like to ask your question?
Hi, Rocky. Thank you so much for your predictions and everything about Industry 4.0. It's totally fascinating, the future of work. I just really feel that Australia is way behind in terms of our internet technology, and, you know, the rest, especially Asia, leading the way with payment systems. South Korea with their 5G, talking about 6G already. Do you have a prediction of when we are going to sort of be up to speed with even just internet access? I mean, it sounds like data is that's the highway.
Yeah, and look, fantastic cat, I've got to say. I've been watching it. Is that battery operated? It's really green. Is it real? It's AR
VR. So that's so I actually left a corporate job to plug into the AR VR Industry 4.0 ecosystem. So fantastic. Here I am learning and playing with AR VR.
So let me answer your question. The world is about to be, awash with connectivity, and I'm not just talking about 5G here. Telcos right around the world, including here in Australia, you know, telcos are spending over $1 trillion putting in mobile networks over the coming 3 years. But there's 71 countries that are putting over 26,000 satellites up in the sky. So, you know, I don't see connectivity as being, or access to connectivity as being an issue, because the world is going to be washed with more connectivity than we know what to do with. And, you know, what we should be truly excited about is that in that, over the coming couple of years, there's going to be 1 billion more people, 1 billion more people, let me say that again, 1 billion more people that are going to be connected to the internet. Now, just imagine what 1 billion people are going to do in relation to innovation, entrepreneurship, and the like, right? This is exciting. So exciting.
That's exciting.
It is exciting, and these are people, you know, in the African subcontinent. These are people in Southeast Asia. You know, these are people in South America. You know, these are people that, you know, so far have not unleashed their creativity, their problem solving, you know, their entrepreneurship. And so, you know, so to me, that's the most exciting thing about connectivity. Whether connectivity comes from the sky, from mobiles, from whatever, I think will be just seamless to us. You know, we won't really, you know, think too much about that, because it's just going to become an expectation. It's just like when you turn the tap on, you just expect water. That's going to be the way, you know, the way of your life. When you wake up in the morning, you're just going to be expected to be connected to, you know, mirrors and sensors in your house and all of that kind of stuff. I think that's, you know, that's the way life will be this decade.
Sounds exciting.
I'm sure it is. Sorry, what's the name of your cat?
Meow.
That's original.
Well, thank you, everyone. And with that, we'll conclude tonight's webinar. Thank you, Rocky, for taking out the time to be with us tonight and sharing your wonderful insights and knowledge and research on the future of Australia in the coming decade. If anyone in the audience would like to know more about Rocky's findings, you can purchase his book on Amazon. The link will be provided in the chat box. And thank you also to the PDF team for making this entire webinar possible. And also thank you all for joining us tonight and engaging in the discussion. Please fill out the polls that will be, so we can better understand the sort of content that you as an audience would like to hear from us. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Rada.
Thank you very much.
you.
Thank you, Rhoda.
Thank you, Rocky.
Thank you, Rocky.
Bye, everyone.
Wonderful session.